Picture this: Turin, Italy, 2003. A man stands on the balcony of his family's historic palazzo, looking out over the city his grandfather built into an industrial empire. He's worth billions. He controls one of the most powerful companies in Europe. He has everything money can buy, and in just a few years, he'll be gone, destroyed not by his enemies, but by the very legacy he was born to protect. This is the story of Giovanni Agnelli, the last king of Fiat, and how the weight of an empire crushed the man who wore its crown, born into an empire. Giovanni Alberto Agnelli was born on April 19th, 1964, into a world most people can only imagine. The Agnelli family wasn't just wealthy. They were Italian royalty without the title, the closest thing the country had to an American dynasty like the Kennedys or Rockefellers. His great-great-grandfather, Giovanni Agnelli, had founded Fiat in 1899, transforming it from a small automobile manufacturer into a symbol of Italian pride and industrial might. His uncle Gianni, known to everyone as L'Avvocato, controlled the empire with a style that made him a legend. By the time little Giovanni Alberto came into the world, the family didn't just make cars. They shaped the destiny of an entire nation. But being born into paradise came with a price that would take decades to fully reveal itself. The boy grew up in a gilded cage. While other children played in parks, Giovanni Alberto wandered through Renaissance palaces. While other kids rode bicycles, he was driven in Ferraris and Maseratis. The family owned more than just companies. They owned newspapers, soccer teams, entire towns where Fiat workers lived and breathed the Agnelli name. Young Giovanni was groomed from birth to one day take control of it all, to become the next guardian of a legacy that employed hundreds of thousands of Italians and represented the country's economic backbone. His childhood unfolded across multiple continents. The family maintained residences in Turin, Rome, Paris, New York, and St. Moritz. Giovanni Alberto learned to ski in the Swiss Alps before most children learned to ride a bike. He spoke multiple languages before he was 10. He attended the finest schools, surrounded by the children of diplomats, aristocrats, and fellow industrial titans. On paper, it looked like a fairy tale. But fairy tales rarely mention the pressure, the expectations, the constant awareness that you're not just yourself, but a symbol of something much larger and far more demanding. The Agnelli family operated under a code as rigid as any royal house. Public behavior was scrutinized. Every word mattered. Every photograph told a story that needed to align with the family's carefully constructed image. Gianni, the patriarch, was known throughout Italy as L'Avvocato, the lawyer, though he'd barely practiced law. What he practiced was power, and he did it with a style that made him a legend. He wore his watch over his shirt cuff. He spoke in measured tones that made politicians nervous. When he walked into a room, Italy's future often walked in with him. This was the man Giovanni Alberto needed to live up to, and the comparison started before he could even understand what it meant. The family curse. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn, one that would cast a shadow over everything that followed. Giovanni Alberto's father was Umberto Agnelli, Gianni's younger brother, a capable industrialist who'd served as Fiat's CEO in the 1970s. Umberto understood the business, understood the pressure, understood what it meant to carry the family name. He'd married Antonella Becci Piaggio, herself from the famous Piaggio family that created the Vespa scooter. Giovanni Alberto was born into not just one industrial dynasty, but two, with manufacturing heritage running through both sides of his bloodline. But the Agnelli family carried a darkness that no amount of wealth could illuminate. Tragedy had stalked them for generations. Gianni's own father had died in a plane crash in 1935. His mother died in a car accident in 1945. Death seemed to circle the family like a patient predator, striking without warning, without mercy, without regard for power or position. And then there was Edoardo, Gianni's only son, Giovanni Alberto's cousin. Born in 1954, Edoardo should have been the obvious heir, the direct line from father to son that would carry fiat into the next generation. But Edoardo never wanted the crown. While Gianni built industrial empires and played chess with prime ministers, Edoardo wanted something simpler, something more real. He studied Oriental literature and philosophy at Princeton. He traveled to the East, searching for spiritual meaning in places far removed from boardrooms and balance sheets. He converted to Islam, taking the name Mahdi. He rejected the polished Agnelli image that his father had perfected. The conflict between Gianni and Edoardo became one of those open secrets that everyone in Italy knew, but nobody quite discussed. Here was the most powerful industrialist in the country, a man who could bend markets and influence governments, and he couldn't convince his own son to follow in his footsteps. Eventually, Gianni gave up trying to groom Edoardo for leadership, recognizing that forcing the issue would destroy them both, which meant the succession had to skip a generation, which meant Giovanni Alberto, nephew rather than son, would have to carry the burden his cousin Edoardo had refused. Giovanni Alberto seemed different from his troubled cousin. Where Edoardo rebelled, Giovanni appeared to embrace his destiny. When his parents divorced in 1974, he moved with his mother to the United States, attending the McCallie School in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Later, he enrolled at Brown University in Rhode Island, graduating in 1986 with a degree in international relations. His thesis focused on the Middle East, demonstrating the kind of global perspective that would be essential for leading a multinational corporation. After graduation, he returned to Italy, determined to learn the family business from the ground up. He didn't just want to inherit an empire. He wanted to earn the right to lead it. At 18, he'd already worked on a Fiat production line under the false name Giovannino Rossi, hiding his identity so he could understand the reality of manufacturing without the deference that came with his surname. He worked in different departments, learning manufacturing, learning finance, learning how to manage the thousands of people whose livelihoods depended on decisions made in wood-paneled conference rooms. Those who worked with him during these years remember a young man who took his responsibilities seriously. He wasn't the playboy some expected a billionaire heir to be. He asked questions. He listened. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding not just how to run the company, but how to make it better. How to navigate the changing automotive landscape where Japanese manufacturers were eating into European market share and new technologies demanded new thinking. In 1987, Giovanni Alberto joined Piaggio, the scooter manufacturer connected to his mother's family. This wasn't a ceremonial position. He worked as assistant to the president, learning the business from experienced managers who didn't coddle him because of his name. 6 years later, in February 1993, at just 28 years old, he was appointed president of Piaggio. The company was struggling, losing ground to competitors, hemorrhaging money. Giovanni saw it as his chance to prove himself, and prove himself he did. Within a year, he'd transformed Piaggio into the leading scooter producer in Europe and the fourth largest globally. He modernized production facilities. He invested in new technologies. He championed employee training programs. He pushed for a company museum that would honor not just the brand, but the workers who built it. He believed, genuinely and passionately, that people were the heart of any successful enterprise. His approach was described as enlightened, progressive, focused on creating value for all stakeholders, rather than just maximizing profits for shareholders. On November 15th, 1993, Giovanni Alberto joined the board of directors of Fiat itself. The Italian press loved the story. Here was the new generation, handsome and educated, ready to lead Fiat into the 21st century. Magazine covers showed him in expensive suits, his dark hair perfectly styled, his expression serious and determined. He looked the part. He sounded the part. In the summer of 1995, Gianni Agnelli made it official, publicly announcing that Giovanni Alberto was his chosen successor, the future chairman of Fiat. The announcement sent a clear message. The succession crisis was solved. The family had found its next leader. Giovanni Alberto was 31 years old, energetic, capable, with a track record of success at Piaggio. He represented hope, continuity, the promise that the Agnelli dynasty would endure for another generation, the invisible enemy. But even as the headlines celebrated his ascension, something was wrong. Something was happening inside Giovanni's body that would change everything. He started experiencing strange symptoms in late 1996 and early 1997. Fatigue that sleep couldn't cure. Difficulty concentrating despite his sharp intellect. Physical discomfort that doctors struggled to explain. At first, the consensus pointed to stress, to the pressure of his position, to the psychological weight of carrying the Agnelli name. Rest more, they told him. Take vacations. Learn to delegate. The advice was well-meaning, but ultimately useless because it misunderstood what was actually happening. In March 1997, doctors discovered what had been attacking him from within, a rare and aggressive form of stomach cancer. The following month, in April 1997, Giovanni Alberto did something that shocked Italy. He called a press conference and announced his diagnosis. He was 33 years old. He stood before the cameras and the journalists and told them he was undergoing treatment. The optimism in his voice couldn't quite mask the reality that everyone could see in his eyes. He sought treatment at specialized centers in the United States, flying between Italy and America as he balanced his fight for survival with his responsibilities at Piaggio and Fiat. The treatments were brutal. Chemotherapy that turned his skin grey and his strong frame gaunt. Surgeries that bought time but couldn't promise a cure. Through it all, he tried to maintain his duties, attending board meetings when he was strong enough, reviewing documents when he wasn't. The Italian public watched the drama unfold with growing horror over those 9 months. Here was their prince, the heir to their industrial crown, wasting away before their eyes. Newspapers tracked his decline with the attention they'd give to a dying monarch. Every public appearance became an opportunity to speculate about his condition. Every photograph was analyzed for signs of deterioration or hope, love and loss. But Giovanni refused to surrender entirely to his illness. He'd already married Avery Howe in 1996, an Anglo-American architect he'd met during his time at Brown University. The wedding had been everything you'd expect from Italian aristocracy, a beautiful ceremony that merged old-world tradition with modern glamour. Friends and family celebrated what seemed like the beginning of a new chapter. Now, facing his diagnosis just months later, that marriage took on a different meaning. Avery stood by him through the treatments, through the pain, through the growing certainty that time was running out. The marriage gave him something to fight for, beyond duty and legacy. In September 1997, just months after his diagnosis, Avery gave birth to their daughter, Virginia Asia Agnelli. Giovanni held his child, knowing what the doctors had told him, knowing that time was running out, knowing that he'd likely never see her grow up. The photographs from those days show a man caught between joy and grief. celebrating new life while facing his own death. The treatments bought him some time, some moments of relative stability, where he could pretend that maybe the doctors were wrong, maybe he'd beat the odds. But cancer doesn't negotiate, and the rare form attacking Giovanni was particularly aggressive. One of his final public appearances came on December 9th, 1997, just 4 days before his death. Despite his condition, despite the pain that was now constant, he attended a Juventus UEFA Champions League match against Manchester United. Juventus, the soccer team his family owned and that he loved with genuine passion, won 1-0. The footage from that night shows Giovanni in the stands, trying to smile, trying to enjoy the moment, but the pain is visible on his face for anyone who knows to look for it. The end. On December 13th, 1997, Giovanni Alberto Agnelli died at his home near Turin. He was 33 years old. He died not from recklessness or self-destruction, but from a disease that struck randomly and killed efficiently. He died with his potential unrealized, his promise unfulfilled, his destiny stolen by biological chance rather than character flaw or personal choice. The funeral was held at dawn, at 7 a.m., in the family tomb at Villar Perosa, outside Turin. The timing reflected how Giovanni had lived, shunning the spotlight, preferring dignity over spectacle. Thousands lined the streets anyway. Politicians, business leaders, and ordinary Italians who worked in Fiat factories came to pay their respects. They weren't just mourning a young man who'd passed too soon. They were mourning the future they thought they'd have, the stability they thought was guaranteed, the continuity that Giovanni had represented. Gianni Agnelli stood at the funeral, looking older than his years, a man who'd survived world wars and economic crises and political upheaval, now brought low by the loss of his nephew and chosen heir. In Giovanni Alberto, he'd seen his own legacy secured. Now he was back to uncertainty, forced to confront the question of succession all over again at an age when he should have been enjoying retirement. The cascade begins. But here's what makes this story truly devastating, what transforms it from merely sad to genuinely tragic. Giovanni Alberto's death didn't just end his own potential. It triggered a cascade of consequences that would eventually threaten the entire Agnelli empire. With Giovanni Alberto gone, the succession became murky. John Elkann, Gianni's grandson through his daughter Margherita, was just 21 years old, barely out of university, completely unprepared to take on leadership of one of Europe's largest industrial conglomerates. Gianni's other grandson, Lapo Elkann, was even younger and, as would later become clear, struggling with personal issues that made him unsuitable for leadership. The power vacuum created chaos. Fiat itself was struggling. The company faced increasing competition from Asian manufacturers who could produce cars more cheaply. Design had stagnated. Innovation had slowed. Market share was eroding in key segments. What Fiat needed was bold, visionary leadership. What it got instead was uncertainty and internal power struggles as various factions within the company and the family jockeyed for position. Gianni, despite his age and declining health, was forced to remain in control far longer than he'd planned. He appointed his brother Umberto, Giovanni Alberto's father, as chairman in 1997. But Umberto was already in his 60s and would himself die from lung cancer in 2004. The careful succession planning that had centered on Giovanni Alberto was in ruins. And then came another blow that nearly broke Gianni completely. On November 15th, 2000, 3 years after Giovanni Alberto's death, Edoardo Agnelli's body was found beneath a highway bridge outside Turin. His car was parked on the viaduct above, engine still running. He was 46 years old. The official determination suggested he'd taken his own life, though questions and inconsistencies would haunt the family for years. Giovanni, who'd already buried one heir, now buried his only son. The man who'd controlled billions, who'd influenced governments, who'd shaped Italy's industrial destiny, couldn't save the people he loved most. The grief must have been unbearable. In January 2003, Giovanni himself passed away at the age of 81, succumbing to prostate cancer he'd been fighting for years. His death marked the end of an era, the closing of the chapter where the Agnelli name alone could move markets and influence governments. He died knowing that the dynasty he'd built was vulnerable, that the succession he'd planned so carefully had fallen apart, that the future was uncertain in ways it hadn't been when Giovanni Alberto was alive. What followed was a period of intense turbulence for Fiat. The company nearly collapsed in the mid-2000s, saved only through a complicated series of restructurings, partnerships, and eventually a merger with Chrysler that created Fiat Chrysler Automobiles. John Elkann, thrust into leadership responsibilities before he was ready, had to navigate crises that would have challenged executives with decades more experience. The question haunted everyone involved. Would things have been different if Giovanni Alberto had lived? Would his leadership have prevented Fiat's near-death experience? Would his vision have modernized the company before the problems became critical? Would the Agnelli empire have remained intact and dominant instead of being forced into a defensive crouch? We can't know the answers, but the questions themselves reveal the magnitude of what was lost when Giovanni died at 33. Giovanni Alberto's life tells the story of a man who approached his destiny with seriousness and dedication. He didn't rebel like his cousin Eduardo. He didn't chase hedonistic pleasures or squander the family fortune. He proved himself at Piaggio, transforming a struggling company into a market leader. He married, had a child, built the foundation for a life that should have stretched decades into the future. By every reasonable measure, he was exactly what the Agnelli family needed, and none of it mattered. The cruel irony is that if Giovanni had been born into a different family, his death would have been a private tragedy, mourned by those who loved him, but not carrying implications that stretched across an entire industry. But he wasn't born into a different family. He was born an Agnelli, and that meant his death became a historical inflection point, the moment when one of Italy's greatest industrial dynasties lost its clear path forward. His wife, Avery, was left a widow before she'd barely begun married life, with a newborn daughter who would never know her father. She eventually returned to the United States, carrying memories of a love story that ended before its middle chapters could be written. The life she'd imagined, the future she'd planned, vanished as completely as Giovanni's own dreams of leading Fiat into a new era. The Agnelli family continued, of course. Families like theirs don't disappear just because one heir passes young. John Elkann grew into his role, surprising skeptics by proving to be a capable leader who helped navigate Fiat through its darkest period. The company survived, transformed, adapted to new realities. The dynasty didn't end, but it was never quite the same. Giovanni Alberto was supposed to be the bridge between Gianni's era and whatever came next. When that bridge collapsed, the family had to ford the river instead of crossing it safely, and they emerged on the other side, battered, less certain of their own permanence. Today, when automotive historians discuss Fiat's struggles in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Giovanni Alberto's passing appears as a footnote, a tragic personal story that happened to coincide with broader industry trends. But those who understand the importance of leadership and succession planning know it was more than a footnote. It was a catalyst, an accelerant that turned manageable problems into existential crises. What's particularly haunting about Giovanni's story is how much preparation went into a future that never arrived. From the moment he was born, resources were dedicated to shaping him into the perfect leader. The best schools, the best mentors, the best opportunities to learn every aspect of the business. His entire childhood and young adulthood were structured around a single goal, preparing him to take the helm of the Agnelli Empire when the time came. And then, suddenly, all that preparation became meaningless. All those years of grooming, all those sacrifices, all those carefully laid plans evaporated in the space of a few months as cancer consumed him from within. The people who worked with Giovanni during his final years at Piaggio and Fiat speak about his determination with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Even as his body failed, even as the treatments left him weakened and sick, he kept trying to fulfill his duties. He attended meetings when he could barely stand. He reviewed reports when his eyes could hardly focus. He was trying, desperately, to be the leader he'd been raised to be, even as it became increasingly clear that time had run out. There's something noble about that determination, but there's also something heartbreaking about it. Giovanni was fighting two battles simultaneously, one against the cancer in his body, and one against the expectations that had defined his entire existence. He couldn't win either battle, but he refused to surrender to both. The business community in Italy watched all of this unfold with growing concern. Fiat wasn't just another company. It was a cornerstone of the Italian economy, a source of national pride, an employer of hundreds of thousands. The uncertainty about its leadership succession wasn't just a private family matter. It had implications for workers, suppliers, dealers, investors, and the broader Italian business landscape. When Giovanni passed in December 1997, the immediate question everyone asked was, what happens now? Gianni was approaching 80, dealing with his own health issues. There was no obvious successor ready to step in. The careful succession planning that had centered on Giovanni Alberto was in ruins. The company faced a leadership crisis at precisely the moment when the automotive industry was entering a period of rapid change and fierce global competition. In some ways, Fiat never fully recovered from this crisis. The company that Giovanni Alberto was supposed to lead into the 21st century ended up struggling through the first decade of that century, losing market share, burning through cash, and eventually needing to merge with an American competitor to survive. The Agnelli family's response to Giovanni's passing reflected their aristocratic training. They grieved privately. They maintained their public composure. They dealt with the practical matters of succession and corporate governance without allowing the public to see too much of their internal struggles. It was classic Agnelli behavior. Present a unified, controlled front to the world, no matter what chaos might be happening behind closed doors. But those who knew the family well could see the cracks. Gianni, the patriarch who'd always seemed invincible, looked diminished. The certainty that had always characterized the Agnelli approach to business and life had been replaced by something more tentative, more fragile. The Italian public's reaction to Giovanni's death was surprisingly emotional. Thousands of people who'd never met him, who had no direct connection to the Agnelli family or to Fiat, felt genuine grief at his passing. Part of this was because Italians had been following his story through the media, watching him rise through the company ranks, celebrating his marriage, watching with horror as his health deteriorated. He'd become a public figure whose life played out in the pages of newspapers and magazines. But there was something deeper at work, too. Giovanni represented a certain kind of Italian ideal. The responsible heir who honored his family's legacy. The educated leader who understood both tradition and modernity. The young man who seemed to embody the best qualities of his generation. When he passed, it felt like Italy was losing not just a person, but a symbol of hope for the future. The timing of Giovanni's death made it particularly cruel. He passed in December, during the holiday season, when families gather and celebrate. Instead of joy and togetherness, the Agnelli family faced grief and loss. Instead of looking forward to the new year with optimism, they faced an uncertain future without the man they'd expected would lead them through it. His daughter, Virginia Asia, would grow up knowing her father only through photographs and stories, through the memories others shared and the legacy he left behind. She was just 3 months old when he died, too young to remember his face or his voice or the way he held her. She inherited his bloodline, his name, his position in one of Italy's most powerful families. But she never got to know the man himself. There's a museum at Piaggio now, opened in 2001, 4 years after Giovanni's death. He'd envisioned it during his presidency, wanting to create a space that celebrated not just the products, but the workers who made them, the community that sustained the company. It bears his name, the Museo Piaggio, and stands as a monument to his brief but impactful leadership. Visitors can see the scooters and motorcycles, but they can also learn about the people behind them, exactly as Giovanni had intended. The legacy. Giovanni Alberto Agnelli didn't destroy himself through hubris or recklessness or moral failure. He was destroyed by the same random cruelty that strikes thousands of people every year. People whose passings don't make headlines because they weren't born into dynasties. The difference is that when Giovanni passed, his unfulfilled potential represented more than just personal loss. It represented an alternate timeline where one of Europe's most important companies might have navigated the 21st century very differently. His grave in Villa Perosa stands as a monument not just to his life, but to all the lives he might have lived, all the decisions he might have made, all the changes he might have implemented, all the futures that died with him on that December day in 1997. In the pantheon of tragic figures in business history, Giovanni holds a unique place. He wasn't brought down by scandal or incompetence. He wasn't destroyed by rivals or market forces. He wasn't undone by his own character flaws or bad decisions. He was simply unlucky, struck by a disease at exactly the wrong moment in his life and in his family's history. The years following his death saw Fiat struggle in ways that perhaps vindicate those who wonder what might have been. Under the leadership of professional managers, the company faced crisis after crisis. By 2002, Fiat had taken out a €3 billion loan it couldn't pay back. The company that had once represented Italian industrial supremacy was on the verge of bankruptcy, facing the prospect of being taken over by its creditor banks. The dynasty endures. Giovanni's father, Umberto, took over as chairman after Gianni's death in 2003, but he was already battling lung cancer. He died in May 2004, just 15 months after his brother, adding another layer of tragedy to a family that seemed cursed by premature death. With both Gianni and Umberto gone, and with Giovanni Alberto having died 7 years earlier, the family faced its greatest leadership crisis in history. John Elkann, thrust into prominence at an age when most people are still figuring out their careers, had to mature quickly. He became vice chairman of Fiat in 2004 at just 28 years old, the same age Giovanni Alberto had been when he took over Piaggio. But unlike Giovanni, who'd had years to learn the business and prove himself, John was learning on the job during a period of existential crisis. To his credit, John proved more capable than many expected. He brought in Sergio Marchionne as CEO, a hard-driving executive who would eventually orchestrate Fiat's survival through the merger with Chrysler. But those early years were touch and go, with the company's survival genuinely in doubt. analysts openly questioned whether the Agnelli family would maintain control or whether Fiat would be broken up and sold off in pieces. Industry insiders who knew Giovanni and watched the crisis unfold often speak in hypotheticals. Would Giovanni have been bold enough to pursue the Chrysler merger? Would he have pushed for radical restructuring? Would his relationships with Italian unions have smoothed difficult transitions? The questions persist because the gap between expectation and reality was so vast. The accumulated grief the family endured was extraordinary. Gianni watched 3 potential heirs die before his own death. His father in 1935, Giovanni Alberto in 1997, and Edoardo in 2000. For the workers at Fiat and Piaggio, Giovanni's death represented the loss of a different kind of leader. His speeches and writings emphasized the human element of business, the idea that companies existed not just to generate profits, but to create value for everyone involved. He talked about workers as the true source of strength, about teamwork and shared objectives. In an era of increasing globalization and cost-cutting, his approach seemed almost quaint, a throwback to a more paternalistic time. But those who worked under him at Piaggio saw the results of that philosophy. The company turned around not just financially, but culturally. Morale improved. Innovation flourished. Workers felt invested in the company's success because they felt the company was invested in them. When Giovanni died, union leaders mourned him genuinely, not out of obligation, but because they recognized they'd lost an ally in the executive suite. The question of what happens to industrial dynasties in the modern world loomed large over Giovanni's funeral and continues to hover over the Agnelli family today. The old model, where a family could control a major corporation for generations through direct management, was already under strain in the 1990s. Professional managers with MBAs and global experience were increasingly seen as necessary for competing in international markets. Family control through holding companies and strategic board positions became the norm rather than direct operational leadership. Giovanni Alberto represented an attempt to square this circle, to combine family heritage with professional competence. He had the education, the work ethic, the demonstrated ability. He could have been both an Agnelli and a modern CEO. His death meant the family had to choose: find another family member who could navigate this balance, or surrender operational control to professional managers while maintaining ownership through financial structures. They chose the latter, which has worked after a fashion. The Agnelli family still controls Exor, the holding company that owns stakes in Ferrari, Stellantis, and various other enterprises. John Elkann chairs these companies, but relies heavily on professional CEOs to run them. It's a different model than the one Gianni embodied, where he was both owner and operator, both dynasty head and active manager. Would Giovanni Alberto have followed Gianni's model, or embraced the more modern separation of ownership and management? His time at Piaggio suggests he would have remained actively involved in operations, unwilling to be just a figurehead. But we'll never know because he never got the chance to show us. The medical community has made tremendous strides in treating gastric cancer since 1997, though it remains one of the more challenging cancers to treat successfully. If Giovanni were diagnosed today, his chances would be better, though far from certain. It's one of those cruel ironies that medicine often advances just after it's needed, that the treatments that might have saved him became available just years after his death. His daughter, Virginia Asia, grew up in the shadow of a father she never knew, carrying a name that opened doors and created expectations in equal measure. She inherited wealth and position, but missed out on the guidance and love that no amount of money can replace. Family members and friends who knew Giovanni speak to her about him, keeping his memory alive through stories and photographs. But it's not the same as having him there. Avery Howe, his widow, chose to step away from the intense spotlight of the Agnelli world. She returned to her own life, her own career, eventually moving forward in the way that widows must when they're still young enough to have decades ahead of them. The Italian press respected her privacy in a way they hadn't always respected Giovanni's, perhaps recognizing that she'd already endured enough. The Juventus soccer team, which Giovanni loved and briefly served as president, dedicated its 1997 season to his memory. Players wore black armbands. Fans held moments of silence. The club, which had won the Champions League in 1996 under his presidency, reached the final again in 1997 and 1998, though they lost both times. Those teams represented the last gasp of Juventus dominance before the club entered a period of transition that mirrored Fiat's own struggles. In Turin, the city most associated with both Fiat and the Agnelli family, Giovanni's death was felt personally by thousands who'd never met him. Turin's economy revolved around Fiat. When the company struggled in the 2000s, the city struggled with it. Unemployment rose. Young people left for opportunities elsewhere. The confidence and prosperity that had characterized the Fiat era began to fade. Whether Giovanni could have prevented this decline is unknowable, but his absence meant there was no one to even try. The broader lesson, if there is one, might be about the fragility of succession planning in family businesses. No matter how carefully you prepare, no matter how thoroughly you groom an heir, no matter how perfectly they seem suited for the role, biology and chance can upend everything in an instant. Smart families have backup plans and contingencies, but even those can prove inadequate when tragedy strikes repeatedly. The Agnelli family's story is exceptional in its scale and visibility, but the underlying dynamic plays out in family businesses worldwide. The second generation that can't or won't take over. The third generation thrust into leadership before they're ready. The talented heir taken too soon. These are universal themes in family enterprise, and they rarely have happy endings. Giovanni Alberto's legacy exists in fragments now. The museum at Piaggio that bears his vision. The memories of people who worked with him and saw his potential. The what-ifs that business historians debate when discussing Fiat's trajectory. The genetic inheritance passed down to his daughter. The cautionary tale about making succession planning contingent on a single individual, no matter how capable they seem. That kind of tragedy lacks the moral clarity of a cautionary tale. It offers no lessons about hubris or excess. It just is, as senseless and cruel as the disease that caused it. And perhaps that's what makes it so haunting. We want our tragedies to mean something, to teach us something, to offer some wisdom that might help us avoid similar fates. But Giovanni's story offers no such comfort. It simply reminds us that sometimes the universe remains indifferent to our plans, our preparations, and our destinies. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.